Back in 1943, of course, the audience for this book was very limited. It was primarily decision makers in the war itself. It was not widely circulated. But the sense was that even in the middle of a great war, it was important to have a sense of what other great wars had involved, what failures and successes had been there, because as early as 1943, many people were seriously thinking about the post-war period, how to build that post-war world order. And Makers of Modern Strategy was hugely influential in that regard. The audience has widened since then, and so this one is intended, as was the previous one, for a mass audience. It's intended for university use. It's intended for students in war colleges and elsewhere. It's intended for anybody with the fortitude to wade through the whole thing, which is like 1,200 pages. You have to be a weightlifter to pick this up and hold it. But nonetheless, it's an impressive product. And the fact that it's gotten bigger over the years, I think, is a sign in itself of a kind of democratization of the discussion on grand strategy, so that it's no longer confined just to elite groups, just to white males, just to distinguished elite professors at prestigious universities. But it's a much wider dialogue that's taking place, intended for a wider audience, for sure.
Just sticking with this theme for a second, I've heard the argument made, Henry Kissinger kind of points at this argument in his most recent book on leadership, that there does seem to be something of a strategy deficit in the present day on the part of the free world, if you'll allow the expression, and that there, granted, this is a point sort of made prior to the invasion of Ukraine, which does seem to have been a strategic blunder on Putin's part. But if we go back to the day before that invasion, you could see making a very straightforward argument that there's something about Putin's Russia and Xi's China. They're just better. They're somehow better at geopolitics and strategy and whatever you want, whatever word you want to use. And there's something about democracies that are just reactive and they're catching up. Is that necessarily the case? Is there something about strategy that's hard for democracies and easier for authoritarians? Or help us understand that.
Well, with all due respect for Professor Kissinger, who's a dear friend, I think there's always been a strategic deficit. I can see a strategic deficit back when the Persians invaded Greece in 480 BC and wound up getting creamed in the Battle of Salamis. I can see a strategic deficit in Thucydides and the great failures that he wrote about. It seems to me there have always been shortcomings. There have always been makers of war who did not understand fully the circumstances of war or the accidents of war. And so that deficit, I think, is nothing new. It's always been there. I certainly would have been one who years ago would have started from the premise that authoritarians do strategy better than democracies do. But the evidence has persuaded me otherwise. I really don't think that's true, particularly in the light of the experience of the Cold War itself. And one of the things I stress in this article is the unexpectedness of the persistence of the idea of containment, the strategy of containment, for some 4.5 decades in unruly democracies, where if you look at the Soviet Union, as Sergei Radchenko does in his article, he sees no consistent pattern. He sees a great deal of experimentation, fumbling, and inconsistency. Certainly we see a lot of that in China as well during the Cold War. And I think the fundamental difference, Aaron, is simply this. Authoritarians don't have feedback mechanisms, don't have the same feedback mechanisms that democracies do. Authoritarians are prone to being told what they want to hear because that's what their subordinates will do, either because they want to rise or because they want to survive. Democracy has feedback mechanisms all over the place. And sometimes that sounds like chaos. Sometimes it invites disorder, for sure. Sometimes it's corrupt. Sometimes it can be creative. But on this, in another sense, it seems to me in the long run, it's profoundly healthy. So I would count on democracies with all of their messiness over the long term to have superior strategic approaches to authoritarians.
I want to get into what you write in your chapter more directly, and you make an observation that I found to be extraordinarily thought-provoking about the tension between what you call timefulness versus timelessness when you're talking about the links between history and historical research on the one hand and strategy on the other. Just tell us what I take you to mean is something along the lines of, when you look at history, there's just so much that happens, and so much of it seems kind of random. How could you possibly develop a guide for future action out of that? And yet here we are attempting to do that. Help us understand the tension and how this all works.
Well, as Mark Twain was supposed to have said, but probably did not, history may not repeat itself, but it rhymes. And I think that's accurate, whether Mark said it or not. And Thucydides said something very much like it in his great history of the Peloponnesian War. He said that the future will not reflect the past. It will not be a precise replication of the past, but it will resemble the past in several ways. And it seems to me that's true. We just have to be very careful about understanding what we mean, or what we should mean, by resemblance. So if what you mean by that is that you can construct some kind of a predictive machine-like theory of history that's going to tell you what the future of history is going to be, something the great authoritarians, or at least some of them, tried to do, I don't think it works that way. I don't think history is predictive in the same sense that a clock or something, a mechanism, is predictive. But if what you mean is, does history widen your own experience by giving you that vicariously, giving you access to the experience of others? Yes, it's immensely valuable in that sense. So the very fact that you can go back and study the mistakes of the past is hugely important, it seems to me. So that's my approach. That's how we teach strategy here at Yale. We don't try to build theories, but we do say that if you have had exposure to the great successes and to the great failures of the last 2,500 years, you have a database. You have a range of experience extending well beyond your own, which distills, if it's done effectively, lessons from the past that you can keep in mind, or should keep in mind. So who is to say that someone who has no experience at all is going to be more proficient than someone who's been well trained? Think of athletics. Is a basketball player who's had no training going to prevail over somebody who's had a really good coach over the years? Of course not. But can the coach come out on the court and tell the basketball player how to make every move? No way. That has to be left to the player. It has to be left to the unpredictability of the game. And so timelessness, it seems to me, is like the rules in athletics. It's like coaching and all of that. It's what you need to know to be proficient in it. Timefulness is just another way of saying accidents will happen. There are unpredictabilities out there. There are things that you will never be able to predict. And you have to be capable of responding to those. But you'll respond better if you know the timeless principles. I'm sorry, that's a time-burdened answer.
No.
That's
No.
right. Yeah.
It's fascinating. It makes me think of Aristotle, who I think it's in the Poetics. Aristotle makes the observation that poetry is more philosophic than history, because everything that happens in poetry needs to happen, whereas in history, I'm obviously paraphrasing here, things just happen.
One, I think a lot of IR scholars reference Machiavelli, but maybe they've read The Prince, or maybe they just have a couple of quotes, better to be feared than loved, but they don't really know him. And then, political philosophers write about Machiavelli, but, they're not experts on geopolitics. So when I started to teach this course 10 years ago, there wasn't really a great source out there to help me get up to speed on what does Machiavelli mean for strategy and geopolitics. So essentially what I tried to do with this chapter was write the chapter I wish I had 10 years ago. And so I think it does provide a kind of good one-stop shop for understanding Machiavelli, his time, and his writing. Yeah, so when I went back and read the original Felix Gilbert piece, it's a good piece, but it does focus exclusively on the art of war. And I think strategy today is just broader than how do you organize your military, and which is what the art of war really focuses on. We have great power competition with Russia and China, sanctions, ideological aspects of the competition, economic decoupling. And so I thought just focusing on, how do you organize for war is too narrow for understanding strategy in the world we live in today, but also unnecessarily narrows down Machiavelli and his contributions, because I think his bigger contributions probably were in the other works, in The Prince, in the discourses on Libby, and not on the art of war. And just one other point, if you read The New Makers of Modern Strategy, as I'm sure you and many of your listeners will or have done already, Hal makes a similar point in the introduction to the book, that in the past, in the past editions, people thought of strategy as kind of military strategy, but in the world that we live in, we do need to think about it more broadly.
So why don't we start with some basics then for folks whose information about Machiavelli is that he wrote The Prince, maybe they read it in college, ends justify the means, etc. Who Give us a bit more. Who was Niccolo Machiavelli? What was the world like into which he was born, and what are the broad strokes of his career?
Yeah, well, he was born in 1469 in Florence, Italy, and died in 1527. So was living at the height of the High Renaissance. Lorenzo the Magnificent was the leader, the Medici prince in charge of Florence when he was a young man. And he was primarily a policymaker. That's how he thought of himself. So when the Medici were overthrown, there was a new Florentine Republic that came in after this brief rule from Savonarola, this Dominican friar. And Machiavelli was appointed to essentially be national security advisor for the Florentine Republic, and had more than a decade in office and went on diplomatic missions to meet with popes and kings, organized the new Florentine militia, led the Florentine militia in a military campaign to retake Pisa, their big rival. And then this was a time of the Italian wars, so a lot of wars on the peninsula. And the Medici, with the backing of the Pope in Spain, were swept back into power. The Medici were put back into power, the Republic overthrown. And they didn't look kindly on the holdovers from the previous government. So Machiavelli was tortured and then exiled to his family farm just outside of Florence. And so that's when he became Machiavelli. He was in exile in the country, not a lot to do. Was Machiavellian in his personal life. We know from his letters he was drinking and having affairs and playing cards. But then he'd go home at night and write, and wrote some of the greatest masterpieces in the Western canon: The Prince, the Discourses on Libby, and The Art of War. So really a remarkable life.
So there, I mean, you state outright, and then the implication of the way in which the chapter is included in this and previous volumes is that there's something foundational about Machiavelli's contribution to strategic thought, but maybe even modern Western thought. What is the case for that? Why is he? There are many important writers. Why is he so important? Why does he come first?
Yes. Well, I titled my chapter Machiavelli and the Naissance of Modern Strategy, the birth of modern strategy. And, he wasn't living through the Renaissance. And like many of his contemporaries in Florence, Michelangelo, Leonardo, and others, he was looking to the ancient world for inspiration and really modernized his field and brought it out of the Dark Ages and into the modern era. And so other scholars, Harvey Mansfield, for example, who's a leading scholar of Machiavelli, before me said that Machiavelli made modern political thought essentially by making a transition from focusing on how you can be good to how you can be effective. And so if you look at the Christian and classical political philosophers who preceded Machiavelli, Cicero, St. Augustine, they focused on how can a leader be good? How can he be just? How can they be honest? How can they be generous? And Machiavelli switches and says, no, how can they be effective? How can they maintain their state? How can they grow their state in terms of power? And so that switch, Mansfield and others said, was really the switch to modern political science, thinking about the effectiveness of political action, not its goodness. And so my kind of contribution to this piece is to just say, well, strategy is really an offshoot of broader political thought. And I think that is a move you have to make to get to modern strategy. Strategy is, after all, about what are you trying to achieve? How can you best get there? And so I think that move from thinking about goodness to effectiveness was necessary.
These are obviously very deep waters about which brilliant people or in which brilliant people disagree fiercely. Maybe it would be best to start sort of narrow and very rooted with The Art of War, which I don't think is as widely read. You point out it was the widest read book that he wrote in his day. I think in our day, you're much more likely to see The Prince being read, and then the discourses tends to get, the prize as the book that earns the most respect. But tell us a bit about The Art of War. What, if anything, does this book specifically have to tell us about strategy that is important or relevant? And was it as revolutionary as the political thought per se?
Well, it was the most widely read in his lifetime, as you point out. It was appointed in his lifetime, was widely read, and influenced many other thinkers. Voltaire, for example, said that Machiavelli taught Europe the art of war. And so he sets it up as a dialogue between a famous mercenary and some young gentlemen in Florence about how to wage war, how to raise an army, how to train the army, how to set up camps, kind of all the details you would need. And it's Renaissance in its method. So he looks to the ancient world. How did the Roman Republic, organize for war? And then what are the lessons of that Italy of his time? And essentially argued that, the Romans did it right, that having foot soldiers packed together in dense formations with armed with armor and swords and shields, now that's the way to fight. And he was skeptical of cavalry and firearms. And so that's what he argued. And some of the major contributions of that book, he was a big skeptic of mercenary armies. He thought that citizen soldiers would be better. And so Felix Gilbert, in his contribution to the original Makers of Modern Strategy, really focuses on that Machiavelli, kind of foresaw the move to professional standing armies of the modern era and away from the mercenaries of the medieval period. And I think that's true. That is a contribution, but I think his contributions are much broader. He also paid a lot of attention to discipline and training in an army, looking at the Roman example as well. And some good quotes that nature makes few brave men, but discipline and training can make many. And one of the controversies of The Art of War is, what did he think about firearms? Because he was living through really the revolution in military affairs, the gunpowder revolution. And during his lifetime, the French used modern artillery to great effect on battlefields in Italy. The Spanish used firearms, arquebuses in southern Italy, effectively, really for arguably the first time. But Machiavelli was skeptical. He said, no, firearms can scare your enemy. Maybe in the early stages they're useful, but once you're underway, they don't really work. You have to engage in hand-to-hand combat. So some have said, he didn't really get it. In his defense, he was writing probably a century before the reforms of Maurice of Orange of the Netherlands really brought the revolution to its full fruition. And he didn't recognize a niche role for firearms in the opening stages of battle. So I cut him a little bit of slack there.
So thinking about it in terms of Makers of Modern Strategy, this kind of textbook for understanding strategy, both counterterrorism and counterinsurgency are trying to address a similar problem of how you deal with adversaries who don't want to fight you face to face, who may be intermixed between the people, who are going to try various non-conventional means of attacking you. These are both kind of two different ways to handle the problem. And counterinsurgency has a little bit of a longer history and legacy, going back to colonial wars, then to wars of decolonization in the early Cold War, then through Malaya, through Vietnam. Counterterrorism is somewhat newer. Its origins come from some of those techniques and those conflicts. Like you think about the Phoenix program in Vietnam, or some of the things the French were doing in Algeria, the kind of network analysis they were doing. There's some counterterrorism roots there. Counterterrorism also starts to rise up in kind of the work that was done in the 70s and 80s on hostage rescue. But overall, counterinsurgency is counterterrorism is a little bit newer in how you use counterterrorism the different techniques to use counterterrorism effectively hadn't really been proven before 2001. It's through the conflict that we see these techniques develop and become more refined. And in this, you also see counterinsurgency and counterterrorism really starting to weave together, such that by the end of it, the two are one, although I would say with the techniques of counterterrorism having a slight dominance over the techniques of counterinsurgency.
Can I want to make a kind of blunt observation that lacks all nuance, and then you can add back in the nuance and tell me where I'm going wrong with it. But this is a thought that occurred to me reading your essay, which was very thought-provoking and incredibly efficient summary of like a vast body of events and successes and failures of the last 20 years. But there's a way to understand counterinsurgency and counterterrorism together, where counterinsurgency, with its focus on protecting the population, is almost more defensive in character, and counterterror is more offensive in character, assuming, of course, that the insurgents and the terrorists are roughly the same people. To what extent is that fair? To what extent is that going to fall apart? Like, how? It's another way of asking the question, like, how do these two things go together?
So I think that's an excellent point. Counterinsurgency tries to make the effort to protect the population, to place forces in an area or in an area that will prevent those villagers from being attacked. Now, we can go in a little bit later, if you like, in terms of what it really means to protect the population. But there's this idea that you should be stopping the insurgents from harming the mass of the population. Counterterrorism on its own doesn't really have that aspect of it. Counterterrorism is more focused on striking the insurgent leadership or even lower level fighters who may be trying to lay IEDs or something like that. But it's more focused on gaining the ISR to find the adversary, using the ISR to fix them, sending in the airstrike or the strike team to take them out, gathering intelligence and information after that, and then repeating the process over again. Yeah. And there's some different ways to refine that process if you want to be doing it rapidly, or if you wanted to do it slowly in a very, very targeted and careful sense, kind of the way they went after Osama bin Laden. But you're right that it's more offensive. The two become blurred over time because a lot of the counter-terrorist activities that we'd be using, and say after 2012, counterinsurgency, the United States ceases to use that word. And the United States basically says, we're not going to follow that. But nevertheless, the activities that were going on, which were very, very counterterrorism focused, would still have aspects of counterinsurgency. So you'd still have the local forces protecting the population. And we might have some people advising them. And like theoretically, we could say, okay, was that just counterinsurgency? Was that a combination of counterterrorism and counterinsurgency? But all that gets, well, too theoretical. I think the more important point is you can have counterterrorism happening with some blurring of what is also protecting the population. Now, similarly, as you know, counterinsurgency can have a lot of blurring too, because in Iraq and Afghanistan, we never had purely counterinsurgency happening or purely counterterrorism. At the height of the counterinsurgency campaign, there was a whole lot of counterterrorism targeting going on. And as you know, there was no battalion out there that didn't have its list of targets that it was trying to go after and trying to plan its own raids and activities. So you can't really say that one is entirely offensive, one is entirely defensive, because it blurs. But I think you are right, and you can kind of draw this general theme for each of them.
A brief anecdote, and then we can get back to business. But the Marine Corps famously can make anything not fun, So I think you sleep outside and shoot guns for a living sounds awesome. It turns out Quantico or Paris Island or wherever, it's actually not as much fun as you think it's going to be. But there we were. There I was in Southern Marja in 2010, and we got a call that there's a high value target about 1,500 meters away from my position, and that night there's going to be a special operations raid on this site. And it is my job to go out and secure the perimeter. And I think this is awesome. This is so cool. I'm going to go see some, dev group, CAG. I'm going to see some high-end stuff tonight. This could be Osama bin Laden for all I know. I don't know. So as the evening goes on, it becomes progressively clearer and clearer that the reality is actually a lot less interesting than the scenario I just laid out. And in fact, the Ranger platoon from Camp Dwyer is about to fly in and pick up some guy who no one could describe to me why this guy is that important in this house. And I furiously call up my battalion and insist that at a fraction of the cost to the taxpayers, my Marines can walk across these fields right now and arrest anyone in that house you want arrested. We can do it. And this suggestion was denied. And the raid also kept getting pushed back further and further. So like 4 a.m, these guys fly in from 20 kilometers away and pick up some guy and break some stuff in the house, and off they go. But in any event, I hear you. So can we talk? Let's talk about, you identify these two Americans as pivotal figures in the development of counterterror and counterinsurgency over the last 20 years, Stan McChrystal and Dave Petraeus. And I thought we might talk about them for a minute and maybe start with McChrystal. What was his role in the development of the American way of counterterror operations?
So he comes into Iraq and he sees that operations are going on and there's efforts to go and target Al-Qaeda in Iraq in particular, Zarqawi. But he sees that the effort isn't as effective or as efficient as it should be. So he notes that we have a lot of stovepipes, that we have different organizations all doing their own thing, different organizations all trying to do targeting, not being coordinated. Plus, you have different supporting organizations, different intelligence organizations, different organizations that might be focus on things like threat financing, that all have some information, some part of the puzzle, but everyone is doing their own thing. So he pulls that together to try to work with all those groups so that you could pool information and pool effort to better focus on what you're doing. Now, with the actual units that are going out and conducting strikes, that's not as hard as bringing together all the intelligence organizations, getting the liaisons on his staff so that he can create his own network. And he was very fond of saying it takes a network to defeat a network because the terrorists are a network. So he's creating his own network that's going to counter that. He also had a different philosophy about the tempo of the targeting. That instead of carefully studying every piece of intelligence and every lead and then waiting to strike, his philosophy was, no, go and strike a lot. Strike as soon as you can, because once you strike, you get more information. And as you get more information, then you can then go after the next target. And you should do it quickly because you don't want the next target to flee. And so he then sets up that kind of operational tempo there. This hadn't been formally established. And it was so effective in going after Zarqawi and then also taking apart some of the Shia Iranian-backed networks in like Baghdad, that then that method had a great deal of credibility and was effectively it was repeated in Afghanistan. Whether we say it's effective or not is a different question, but was repeated later on. So that's why he becomes this pivotal figure there. David Petraeus is also a pivotal figure. Now, counterinsurgency, like I said, had a much longer lineage and had lessons that had existed previously. Petraeus knew some of those because of his education, and he was informed by a broad number of officers and academics who also added to the knowledge base there. You'll be familiar with names like David Kilcullen or John Noggle. And so he looked at the operations that were going on. He said, these operations don't fit with how what the lessons of counterinsurgency have been. And he starts to create the new doctrine. The other thing that's important about him here is his energy and his determination to create the new doctrine, to push through bureaucratic obstacles, to create the field manual, to argue against those who are saying you can't do that. This should all be focused purely on killing. And then to go to Iraq and start to spread word of it, to implement it, to make sure units on the ground were actually doing it. And that, of course, leads to that is part of the Iraq surge and the success that occurred in the Iraq surge. Now, the fact that Iraq was successful this part of Iraq was successful, helps legitimize both McChrystal's concept of counterterrorism and Petraeus' concept of counterinsurgency.
So again, we'll come back to this Iraq-Afghanistan distinction in a second, because I think it's sort of at the center of understanding the period. But just to step back for a second on counterinsurgency in particular, as you point out, there's this rich literature, which in turn stems from this rich experience of, essentially Western militaries fighting in a, colonial, post-colonial environment, and often fighting Marxist-inspired movements, right? And I think that's where the literature really sort of the foundational literature frames itself. Is there a way in which fighting insurgencies in an Islamic extremist context is different from fighting insurgencies that stem from sort of Marxist thought, or is there so much continuity that the differences are essentially not that important?
So some people have been able to draw some similarities between the two, but so similarities like the Marxist insurgencies tended to have fairly strong command and control and cohesion across the movement. And some people will say, well, the Taliban, I would say the Taliban similarly have strong cohesion. Some people will say some of these Islamic insurgencies also have this kind of cohesion that could be an explanation for their effectiveness. I guess I'm I'm uncomfortable making too many comparisons between the two as a historian. But I would say that there are certain things that are worth thinking about when it comes to an Islamic insurgency. And I'm not certain how much these are 100% different from a Marxist insurgency. But the kinds of things I think about when I look at an Islamic insurgency is, well, first of all, are they as cohesive as other insurgencies? And on the one hand, I might say, oh, they are. Look at how cohesive the Taliban were. On the other hand, I might say, I'm not sure about that. In some places, tribal divisions end up fragmenting the Islamic insurgency. Or another way to put it is that the notions and codes of Islam were not legitimated enough or enforced enough in certain insurgencies to overcome the tribal divisions, is a more kind of academic way I might say it. But so you might look at, well, the Taliban were cohesive, but the Iraqi insurgency was less cohesive. You might say the AQI was cohesive, but all those other resistance groups that were more tribally oriented were not so cohesive. You might look at the TTP in Pakistan, or the Pakistani Taliban, and note they have they're very fragmented. So you see some differences there. The other thing that I would point to that has struck me, of course, in Afghanistan is the degree of motivation and inspiration the Taliban were able to garner by the fact they were fighting an occupier, and by the fact they were fighting an occupier in an occupier who was not Islamic in an Islamic country. And they were able to motivate their forces, I believe, to do a lot because of that. Now, is that different from a Marxist insurgency? Well, some I would say yes, but I mean, were the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong motivated? Absolutely they were. Were they motivated partly because of U.S. occupation? There's going to be a lot of debate on this point. But were they motivated from U.S. occupation? Yes, they were motivated partly by that. So you might see, you can see some similarities that might exist there too. But I don't know, hopefully that explores the question.
Sure.
All right.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it.